Thanks again for joining the webinar. It looks like we have a great turnout, which means that all of you are interested in learning how to increase sales engagement by 3,066%. And that is a legit statistic. And we're going to jump into those details in just a moment. If you have any questions, we'll answer them throughout the presentation. We want this to be interactive so if you do have a question, go ahead and hit that Q&A button. You can pop your question in there, and we'll be sure to answer your questions as we're moving throughout the presentation. But just before we jump into it, I'd like to give our hosts the opportunity to introduce themselves and just tell you a little bit about who they are. Josh, we'll go ahead and start with you.
Thank you. My name is Josh Sweeney, the founder of FounderScale, and I'm a member of the Atlanta chapter of the Entrepreneur Organization. I'm actually the president-elect for the 21-22 year, which I'm really excited about. So as you might expect, I have a passion for entrepreneurship and helping other entrepreneurs succeed. I'm married and have 2 boys who I coach and lead in sports and other activities, which is another fun part of my life after entrepreneurship. And on the business side, in 2009, I started a CRM consulting firm, which I bootstrapped to a few million in revenue before selling it in 2016. And during that journey, I learned numerous costly sales and sales leadership lessons. You see, in that last company, I spent hundreds of thousands of dollars figuring out how to generate sales in a founder-led B2B business. And it's because of those challenges and lessons that I started FounderScale, where we specialize in increasing sales for those founder-led or similar founder-led B2B businesses. I'm also excited to co-host this webinar with Mindy Rosser, another B2B expert. So Mindy, can you tell us a little bit about your experience?
Yes. Hi, my name is Mindy Rosser. I'm the founder of Mindy Rosser Marketing. I'm one of the earliest alumni from Seth Godin's Alt MBA program for forward thinkers, and I absolutely love LinkedIn. I live on Oahu in Hawaii. I am married, have a boy and a girl, and we love to enjoy the outdoors, weightlifting, surfing, adventures, and island life. Almost a decade ago, I got into the social media space where I worked within the agency world with startups, and then decided to branch out on my own full time to work directly with business owners and subject matter experts on their social presence, building thought leadership, and eventually working with them to fill their pipelines with their ideal clients using LinkedIn. As an entrepreneur, I value freedom and coloring outside the lines, and I love building systems that work on LinkedIn and testing them to generate results for my clients. In today's webinar, we are going to share with you how to use LinkedIn and interview style podcasts to increase B2B sales. So let's start this presentation with a brief intro to LinkedIn, plus a real world scenario that's happened to all of us. So as the go-to B2B social media platform for most industries, LinkedIn is all too often misunderstood and mistreated, just like email. Many people tend to use LinkedIn to blast messages to a number of prospects, and this leads to burning bridges before you've even had the chance to start the relationship. And as you see on this slide, here's a real world example of this. We call this the contact and pitch. And this happens whether it's messaging someone on LinkedIn or sending an email. This is the situation where a person like this individual connects to us and then immediately follows up with a very long message telling us all about her company and asking for a call. I'm sure many of you have had this happen before, but the question is, why does this happen? It happens because, surprise, it actually works when a prospect has a pressing need for your service and the timing is right for them. Now, people wouldn't contact and pitch if it didn't work at all. The problem is, it doesn't work very well. It works just enough that sales reps continue to do it without looking at alternatives. So in the real world, how well do we see the contact and pitch actually work? Josh, I think you have some numbers for us.
Yeah, I do have some numbers. So these are the contact and pitch numbers from 3 different campaigns, real world campaigns. And just to clarify, this is where a sales rep reached out to a target prospect cold who didn't know them and immediately pitched them for a meeting. So in row 1, what you'll see is this person reached out to this sales rep, reached out to 452 target prospects that were in their ideal customer profile. They had 3 valid engagements, which were people who showed positive interests. And you see on the second row, you have 188 outreaches. In another campaign, there was 0 engagement. And then the third one is another example where you see a higher volume where a sales rep reached out to 5,000 contacts, got 5 valid engagements, and that's about a 0.1% engagement. So that's why people run these type of campaigns, the contact and pitch campaigns. But as you can see from an effectiveness perspective, they're not actually very effective. We have to ramp up the cost in data purchases and volume from the reps to get meaningful results. And that takes a lot of work. The other thing that we have observed is that the primary reasons companies do the contact and pitch model is that they don't actually have anything valuable to offer a prospect to pull them in. And that's value from a content or engagement perspective. But we're going to show you a better way. So Mindy, you have some data that shows what happens when we approach prospects with value. And I'd love for you to share some of those numbers.
All right, so let's talk through those numbers. So as you will see in this next graph, the amount of outreach done for a client on LinkedIn over the span of 1 month, and this is using the interview style podcast approach. So if you look in column 1, you'll see a total of 200 unique prospects that we reached out to, and these were actually hand selected by the client as a good fit for the podcast and also a good prospect. And notice that sample size is much smaller than what we saw in the contact and pitch slide. Now in column 2, you'll see the number of messages that we sent in that sequence. The first message was a LinkedIn connection invitation, and the second was a thank you message asking them to join the podcast as a guest. And this was sent after the person accepted the invite to connect on LinkedIn. In column 3, that's the number of people, a whopping 38, who agreed to a podcast pre-call with the client as a result of one of those 2 messages. And the results in column 4 show us that 19% of people were ready to talk with the client from those 200. And that's really high compared to less than 1% with the contact and pitch approach. Now, I'm not so good with math, Josh. Can you explain how we got to 3,066% from this 19% engagement rate?
Yeah, of course. So I know when everybody saw this email or looked at the registration, they weren't sure if they wanted to sign up because this is such a crazy number, but we do have some math that supports it. So if you look at the contact and pitch example that we had earlier, where the sales rep is just trying to set a meeting with someone who's never heard of them before, those received a 0.6% engagement. And if you recall, that was the high number, right? The other number was 0.1. And so now if we calculate the increase from 0.6 to 19 with outreach to join a podcast, for example, the podcast of value here, that's a whopping 3,066% increase. And the great thing about this is the efficiency. So we are using a lot less data, we're doing a lot less work, and we're getting more engagement from the prospect when we outreach for that interview style podcast. The other benefit that you get from them is you get to do a face-to-face interview and start building that relationship on the podcast. So Mindy, can you tell us more about building relationships via LinkedIn before we talk about the interview style podcast?
And just before you do that, Mindy, we have a couple of questions that have come in. The first one says, a challenge that we're having is that we can't send messages until the connection request has been accepted. What suggestion do you have about getting people to accept your invitation? And it sounds like you're probably going to talk about that in your next section.
Yes, we will talk about that in the next section. But in general, when you're thinking in terms of sending a connection invitation, it's really important that there is something of value to the person on the other end of that connection invitation. And if there's no reason and a good reason for them to accept, it's less likely that they are going to accept. So it does pay to spend some time up front actually thinking through what that connection invitation should be. And let's talk about that a bit. So building real relationships on LinkedIn requires a smarter and a human-based approach. So when you're starting a real relationship with someone, rather than just hoping this person needs your services right away, you open yourself to more business collaborations and opportunities long-term. And on a side note, it's a strategic way to also build your business network on LinkedIn. So it's important to get off to a good start. And this means you should spend some time up front doing your homework on each prospect. And what does this mean? It's spending time looking at each prospect's LinkedIn profile, their posts, their website, to learn what you can about them before you even send that connection request, a message, or an email. Then it's personalizing that first message and also giving them a really great reason to engage with you. And that's the key. There's got to be some obvious value to them. And on the slide, you'll see we're going to talk about 4 good reasons to engage with you. So the first is building a community. So if you have a community that these people may find value in because it centers around some topics in their industry or focus area, then it really is a natural fit for you to invite them to join. And this approach is most effective when you have an established or growing community. And Josh, I think you have a group that you do and a community.
Yeah, so we host Founders and Brews, where we invite founders to connect with each other once per month at a local brewery. Would that be an example of building community and a reason to outreach on LinkedIn?
Yes, I think that's actually a great way to do some outreach and a way to engage with people in a way that's also fun. So inviting somebody to join Founders and Brews is lighthearted, it's fun, it provides value to them as well. So I think that's a great example. But what do you do if you don't have a community like Founders and Brews? Another option, as you'll see on the slide, is researching a book or an article. So maybe you're writing a book or you're conducting research for an article and you need some input from experts in that field, and that would be valuable. So asking a prospect to contribute can be a win-win if they are getting cited or promoted as a result of providing that input. The third thing is taking a poll or survey. So this is one of the easiest asks for people you don't know to engage with your content. It's especially useful if you're trying to build some credibility in a new industry or start relationships with a new audience where you don't have as many connections. And the last one is the interview style podcasts. And I think, Josh, you have some ideas about how these are working for your clients. And I'll let Josh go into more details explaining the value here.
Sure. So just like all of the other relationship building options that Mindy mentioned, interview style podcasts are another way that you can provide value and achieve that 19% engagement rate that we shared earlier. So what I'd like to do is explain a little bit about how the interview style podcast works. On our left, on the left of the slide, is one of our clients, Jim Oliver. He hosts the Breakaway Wealth podcast, where they talk about creating wealth and the concept of infinite banking. They do a lot of work with real estate investors, business owners, and other high net worth individuals. And we work with them to put together the podcast, the content, execute outreach to get interviewees on the show. And our goal is to set up interviews for Jim that matches his target client. When we do that, he gets to spend 30 minutes during that podcast having a face-to-face Zoom interview. And he's using this platform to build a relationship with someone that may be hard to get in front of otherwise. And the thing is that a certain percentage of those interviewees are actually going to take interest in the service that Jim offers, and they'll want to know more, and they'll turn into B2B sales revenue. Contrary to the connect and pitch model, the interview style podcast also provides additional marketing benefits on the back end, where you have the opportunity to generate more content and use that in other ways. So what I'd like to do is just share a few more of the benefits of the interview style podcast and why it works. So benefit number one is you start to become an influencer on the topic and rise above other people in your space through the knowledge that you share on that podcast. Another benefit is what we call the one-to-one to many sales engagement. So you're spending time one-on-one with a person, with that prospect during that interview, and then that content is actually going out to a larger audience, which also builds up over time. And this is great for SEO and other just general content creation purposes for inbound marketing. Number three is it's free marketing content for the interviewee. So that's another great part of the engagement because you're giving that person that you're interviewing something in return with very low cost to them. And we often see that the interviewees actually take that podcast and put it on the media section of their website. They share it on social and use it in many other ways that helps them and helps you while you're building up that show.
So Josh, we do have another question that's come in. I'm just going to pause you there. In your experience, how long does it take to build up a presence as a thought leader?
Yeah, so how long it takes to build up a presence as a thought leader can vary by the volume of content you're getting out. So we have packages where people are doing and clients that are releasing two podcasts a month. So one every other week. We know and have clients that are releasing weekly, and some are doing that with other sales engagement type of content. So I would say it's between 3 to 6 months based on the volume before you start to rise above other industry experts. And it also does have a comparison or impact depending on which industry you're in and what those other competitors are doing.
Thanks, Josh.
So before we go further, let's do a quick recap of what we've gone over today.
Yes, so to recap, today we talked about giving people a great reason to engage with us. And this is increasing the likelihood that people will do more good business and we'll do more good business with more good people. That's how I like to think of it. And these long-term sales engagements result from building a real business relationship. There really aren't any shortcuts. And when you try to add shortcuts like the contact and pitch, they don't perform as well. So it really pays to do your homework up front. And one simple way to get into conversations and build those relationships is to use the interview style podcast approach, along with a few of the others that we talked about if that one's not a fit. So really think about how you're approaching your business development and how you're getting into these sales engagements in a way that's providing value.
Thank you, Mindy. So before we get into the final questions, and if you do have a question, please click that Q&A button. We're happy to clarify items around the content today or anything on LinkedIn or podcasts in general. But I want to share quickly how this all comes together. So how it comes together, there's two different packages and there's two different ways to think about this. So from Founder Scale perspective, we have the Founder Scale Attend package, which is the creation and distribution of that podcast, that interview style podcast. And then the second package we have is the Amplify package. Mindy, you want to tell them about that?
Yes, the Amplify package is where we're actually doing the outreach to get prospects signed up for those interviews. So that includes multi-channel outreach, which could be LinkedIn, email, and other channels that might be appropriate.
All right, so before we get into questions, on our last slide is my and Mindy's email address. So if you do have any other questions or think of anything after the Q&A portion here, please feel free to reach out. We're happy to help. Nicole, you want to go over any questions that we have in the Q&A box?
Yeah, sure. One question that we have is, are there any metrics about how many connections actually convert?
Yes, in terms of how many connections actually convert, we did see that number earlier in the slides where we saw 19% actually having conversations with the client. And that number to close those conversations and turn those into business really depends on your sales process and what your business model is. But typically we see probably about 1 to 2% of those people actually closing a new business for the clients I'm working with.
That's great. Thank you, Mindy. Another question that we have is, what tools do you use to find a client's target audience?
Yeah, so I know we use a number of tools. So there's all kinds of services out there like Clearbit, there's LinkedIn searches, and there's a number of other products out there like ZoomInfo that are available. And so we use a number of tools to combine all of that data and do the research to provide prospects that we're reaching out to that are in their ideal customer profile.
Thanks, Josh. We'll give one more minute for questions.
Looks like there is a question from Ellen. What would be a good way to introduce yourself to a perfect prospect? And I think we talked a little bit about this earlier in the connection invitation, but I think in introducing yourself, you're thinking about value to them and how you can be a resource to them, how you can help them achieve their objectives. So I think taking the focus off you at the beginning, especially, and really focusing on what issues they may be experiencing would be a really good way to think about it. And then when that conversation begins, I think there will be an opportunity for you to actually tell them more about you, to tell them more about your services. And one other thing to consider there is also having a really good LinkedIn profile. So if you haven't thought about your LinkedIn profile in that way, think through it as almost like your website on LinkedIn. People are going to look at your LinkedIn profile when when they are seeing your messages. So pay attention to that, because that's also a way to introduce yourself to a prospect without even having to say it.
Yeah, it looks like there was another one, Mindy. What should I do if my prospects don't respond to more than one message? Should they keep messaging them?
That's a really good question, and it is a point of contention for a lot of LinkedIn experts. Some people will just continue messaging until you either disconnect, or, the prospect either disconnects from you, and it gets really annoying. So I think something to keep in mind is if you've sent 2 messages and they haven't responded to you at that point, you may want to try one more and just say, I'm just checking to make sure you got this, and give them a way to opt out if they're really not interested. But I would not just keep messaging them until they answer. That can get annoying and could also turn into feeling spammy for them, and you could get blocked as a spammer. So try to avoid that if at all possible.
Yeah, I know one thing we are big advocates of at FounderScale is multi-channel outreach. So what we find is people use different channels, just like you'll run into people that really like texting and they're like, hey, if you send me email, I may not respond, but just text me. That's even in business situations that I'm in every day, which is interesting. So we like to go multi-channel. If you message them once or twice or connect and they're pending, they're not responding, you can switch over to email, you can switch over to making a phone call. You can do a book drop on location if you're able to. There's a number of different channels, and we just have to keep in mind that any one channel is going to work for a certain group of people, but multiple channels is definitely going to get responses from more people.
That's a good point. Another question. How do you generate leads from LinkedIn? That's a very broad question. So I think it's really thinking through in terms of like, who is your target audience? Are they active on LinkedIn? So that's something you'll want to think about from the get-go before you start using LinkedIn as a channel. And then actually finding those leads can sometimes be tricky for people if you don't know exactly how to use LinkedIn and the search features. But it really is running a very comprehensive LinkedIn search and then reviewing the search that LinkedIn generates to see what percentage of those people actually look like good prospects. And then it's reaching out to them. So it's thinking through how you're going to approach them, whether it's using the interview style podcast or one of those other methods we talked about earlier, or if you want to use something completely different altogether. But think about really focusing on the relationship. So it's really building the relationship with people on LinkedIn and how can you start that conversation. It's not just about generating leads, because when we think about just leads, it's not the same as relationships. So on LinkedIn, I like to think of it in terms of relationships, and it does take longer to close sometimes than if you're approaching it with a leads mindset, but it's worth spending the time to build those relationships long term. Josh, any thoughts on that?
I like what you said there at the end around, I was thinking the same thing around, it's not about how you generate leads on LinkedIn, it's how you build relationships on LinkedIn. Because when we start talking about generating leads on LinkedIn, we think about it, I think just naturally we think about it a little more transactionally. How do I get somebody to engage and close a deal tomorrow or close a deal very quickly? And then we set expectation for sales management and leadership. It's what's going to happen. And it's generally not the case. So if we think about it as how are we building relationships using LinkedIn, it's going to take a little longer, but it's going to have a better impact. For example, I'm not closing a deal if I have somebody on an interview style podcast, but I am starting a relationship. And if they're interested in the services we offer, they're going to ask about that immediately. And I got beneficial content from that. They got beneficial content. And there's all kinds of other ancillary benefits from that. Whereas, if you're just reaching out and contacting and pitching to generate a lead, that's kind of, they either respond or they don't. And from our numbers, most of them don't.
Good point.
All right, so it looks like we're up on time. So we'll follow up with if there are any other questions, we will follow up on email. And if you have anything else that comes to mind after this, please shoot us an email. Nicole?
Yes, thanks again for joining us on how to increase sales engagement by 3,066%. Just as Josh mentioned, we'll be sending a follow-up email with all of these details as well as a link to the webinar recording from today. Thanks again for joining us.